Welcome to Calming the Chaos, where I help you find peace in a chaotic world. I'm Tracy Cannella, licensed mental health counselor who talks about chaos from a mental health perspective. And I give you self-help resources you can use to calm your chaos in any situation in this world. Isn't this fun? It's not a substitute for counseling or psychotherapy, but just a lot of helpful hints and tools. So if you're on board, feel free to tune in. And now, let the chaos begin. Today is October 18th, and so there's nearly 2 weeks until our presidential election in the United States of America. And just saying this causes a lot of chaos, and a lot of chaos has been brewing amongst the American people. I can feel it rising as the election grows nearer. And a lot of these issues that are important to Americans are coming to the forefront right now of the discussion. And some people don't know what the answer is. And so the question becomes, what should we do? Here to help us figure that out is my friend Ramsey Zimmerman. Now, Ramsey and I have known each other for over a decade now. And you know what? We've really never discussed political topics in this kind of depth. He is now a podcaster too, just like I am. He has a podcast called What's Worthwhile. And so what we're going to do is explore 4 political issues that are causing Americans chaos. Now, the discussion went kind of long, so we're going to divide this into 2 parts. We're going to explore the first 2 issues in part 1 of this podcast episode, and then we're going to explore the second 2 issues in part 2 of this podcast episode. So sit back, relax, or take notes if you'd like. This discussion is an important one because it helps us to understand the important issues to the American people in considering who we're going to vote for in the upcoming election. And it also helps us to handle our chaos. So check it out.
Thanks, Tracy. How's it going? It's great to be here today.
Yeah, I mean, it's nice. Like you said, this will be fun, question mark. We're going to try and make it.
There is no shortage of things going on in the world and in this election cycle that will lead us to chaos. So I think there's plenty of opportunities for having an interesting conversation today.
Yeah. How about you tell us a little bit about yourself and what you're doing and just anything that you think that our listeners might know just to get to know you a little bit better, Ramsey?
Yeah, I'd be happy to do that. So, I have been sort of in the professional world for about 30 years, and I was in the renewable energy efficiency space on and off for most of that time. And but recently I have been going through sort of career change and priorities changes. Each time that I kind of hopped from one position to the next, I felt like I was getting a little bit further and further away from what I really wanted to do and what was really important to me. And, it's not that I thought that energy issues were any less important. It was more like there were just other things that were becoming more important to me. And so I founded and started this podcast asking the question, what's worthwhile? And it was a question for myself, but also a question for other people, with all of the things happening in the world today and all of the messages, how do you really understand and look at which one is worth looking at, which is worth focusing on? And so hard to even tell what is true in the world today. So went through that journey and kind of made a decision for myself that I would focus on mind, body, and spirit wellness. And I'm now kind of a full-time student studying holistic health and nutritional therapy, and still doing my podcast and interviewing lots of really interesting people, and looking at the world through this wellness lens. And I really appreciate the lens that you look the world at through in your podcast, because there is a tremendous amount of chaos in the world, and there's no it's not helpful for people. So people need to figure out and navigate how to understand the conflicting messages that we see constantly coming from the people that we know, but also from the mainstream media and from social media. And this time of year, this cycle, elections are always contentious, but I mean, this feels like perhaps one of the most contentious elections that I've ever lived through.
Mm,
And so it's a great time to, stop and think about these things. I think a big part of the chaos is that we're not really encouraged to talk about these things with people who disagree with us. We have echo chambers that people are inhabiting, and that's in their real life, but even more so online in their sort of social media circles. Uh, and it's always been impolite to talk about things like religion and politics, right? That's an old cliche.
yeah.
And yet, those are two of the most important things potentially in our lives and in our world. And we're often not allowed or encouraged to talk about those things. And so I think that people should have more difficult conversations, and they're called difficult because they are, but there are ways in which to have those, and we can maybe model some of that behavior
Mhm,
for viewers today as we talk about it, but also kind of I'd like to really kind of at least attempt to reflect the complexity of issues and try to sort of show and how reasonable people can disagree and how they can see things really differently from multiple sides and angles. And I think that kind of an approach is a way in which people can be more peaceful in their interactions with each other.
mhm. We can have these conversations and we can survive them, right? And we can
Right.
actually maybe grow from them and look at things from other perspectives. And I think that's what the spirit of this show has been about and will be about today, is to bring an issue or issues. We have 4 of them planned, and be able to talk about them and have possibly differing points of view and get through it.
Sounds great.
All
What should we
right.
talk about first?
Well, so I'm just going to go with the economy. So your contribution was to be able to actually divide it into a couple of different issues, which I appreciated, and the
Yeah,
purchasing power and the business side of it. So why don't you go ahead and tell me what your thoughts were when you looked at the economy, and I put the economy, our money, and that's all I put. And you were very thoughtful about, well, this involves a little bit more than that. And I like the way that you went into the weeds on this. So tell me,
sure.
I'm curious about knowing what you were thinking when you saw the economy on the list.
Yeah, sure. I mean, is it Bill Clinton that's credited for, it's the economy, stupid. Um, it The economy is certainly something that is front and center for everyone because it affects, what we can do and what it's purchasing power. So purchasing power is like how much can you go out and buy per dollar for that dollar that you have. And it seems like people's purchasing power have not fully recovered since the recovery from the pandemic, and for a variety of reasons. So inflation is higher and has been higher these past few years than at any other time in the past couple of decades. And it appears that inflation may not be nearly as bad as it was, but sort of the best news that people can say is like, inflation's not quite as terrible as it was 6 months ago or a year ago. But in terms of prices, groceries and essentials and food and fuel, they're still high. Purchasing power is what people are able to get for themselves. And so, you're able to get things for yourselves either based on how much money you have or how much money you can borrow. And I think many people in the past few years have run through their various credit lines and interest rates. Again, interest rates have come down a little bit, but they're also extremely high. I think mortgage rates are something in the neighborhood of 6.5% these days, between 6 and 7. And interest rates were up until 3 years ago, uh, very, very low. When the economy is like this, it adds pressure, right? And what is the solution? It's very difficult to say exactly what the solution is, but everyone kind of feels the problem. And when politicians tell us that, oh, it's not nearly as bad as it was, that it feels kind of flat in terms of a response. And meanwhile, it's difficult and ironic because the stock market remains at all-time highs. So somebody must be doing well. It feels like it's the really large corporations that are doing really well in the economy. And look at what happened in the pandemic. It was the biggest companies that fared the best in terms of how and what they survived. And it was the Main Street or the local businesses that often had to close, and many of which never recovered. So the economy is, I think, a very big stress point for everyone. I haven't spoken with anyone in my personal life who thinks that the economy is great. Everybody has a different idea about why and how it's bad, and a different idea about why and how to help it. But it seems to be consensus that things are not good. And I think in terms of, I think something like 67% or more of people surveyed say that the country's on the wrong track versus the right track. So it sort of describes that. But I don't know. What do you think about the economy?
I think of that proverbial frog in the boiling pot of water, although it's not boiling at first, but the frog's in the water, and then the heat turns up, and then some of these frogs, or most of the frogs, they don't realize that the heat's turning up. So that's sort of
Yeah.
why I think about inflation, is that we have been in this sort of slow moving uptick where we wake up one day and realize that gas is over $4 a gallon or nearing $5 a gallon. And in Washington state, where you and I live, being is saying, that it is one of the most expensive places to live in the United States. It's pretty expensive to live here. And then, these economical markers such as eggs, milk, and gas. Those are the things that, you look at and wow, I remember paying 99 cents a gallon for gas. Of course, that was in the early 90s. And I remember paying, only like a couple of bucks for eggs or milk or whatever. And now it is a slow boil. And then you realize, oh my gosh, I'm boiling. But the frog in the pot doesn't jump out. It just stays there. It doesn't do anything about the inflation. It doesn't do anything about the boiling water because it doesn't really notice or care. And then what happens is they die, which is sort of a dour way of describing the economy. But I think that if we
And you can have
realize,
frog's legs for dinner, though. So,
oh gosh, yeah, yeah, that's
well, I
I've
think the
never.
frogs, the frogs are maybe not, being lulled to sleep. I think the frogs might be screaming, just to
Mhm.
change up your analogy a little bit. Um, yeah, we've all been frogs in that boiling pot, and I think we're still in the pot. But instead of cooling down and calming down, I think most of us feel agitated, and we're feeling the stress and the pressure, and we're screaming about it, and we're irritated. And human nature is to look around and find somebody to blame. And so I'm sure there's a lot of that going on. And people are, many people are trying not to do that. And, that's, I think, what we ought to be trying not to do, to blame people instead, to look for solutions. But it's really tough when that water is quite hot.
Yeah, and when you said scream, I thought of the lobsters, right? Because that's the
Yes.
same thing. They scream, but they can't jump. Now,
Yep.
frogs can jump, but they can't scream. And it's interesting that I'm thinking about boiling animals in water. I just really didn't think a conversation would go this way, but here it is.
So
Um,
there you go. We're the lobsters in the pot.
there we go. Yeah, so who are the lobsters? Who are the frogs? And who is actually screaming? Who has the capability? This is where, wages and earning potential, savings, and the people who have the power to jump out of the pot or to scream. And some people don't feel like they have the power, but then they still have this chaos because things are changing rapidly and they don't have any control over it, which I think really puts the pressure on people to either try and understand or defend against it or to be able to survive. To me, inflation and the economy has to do with the survival thing because whenever you talk about money, it brings up these survival issues that people have. And that's why it's one of the number one, this is the number one thing that happened in the debate, the very first topic that they talked about. And the one presidential debate is what I'm referring to. But yeah, so that's the purchasing power part of it is that what sort of power do we actually have in this economy? Do we feel powerless? And what are we going to do about that? There's only so much that we can change within ourselves and within our own power. The other part is having to accept reality and what is going on around us. And that's a tough ask right now for a lot of people. What do you think?
Yeah. I mean, there's only certain things that you can take control of yourself, right? So you can, uh, try to curb your spending. You can try to, be really focused about what it is that you spend money on. But you got to eat and you got to pay rent or pay your mortgage. You got to buy fuel for your car. Um, and people need to take care of their health and, have to pay for prescriptions or healthcare or however you do it. So
Hmm.
I think part of taking back control of that is just being very deliberate about who you buy from, right? So we have choices about where and how we shop. We can just be a mindless consumer and buy things that we don't need, or we can be really deliberate about it and only buy the things that we do need. We can choose who the retailer is that we shop from. If we like to buy online, you can buy online from a faceless mega website, or you can go and find handcrafted, beautiful little things on someplace like Etsy and support, a local business owner that way. And likewise, if you're buying things out in the brick and mortar world, you can choose to go to an international mega chain retailer, or if you can still find one, you can go to a locally owned business or even a local regional chain to do that shopping. And, do you need to buy things or can you fix them? Can you replace them? Can you repair them? Can you trade them with your neighbors at garage sales or, on websites? So, maybe the only thing that we can do in sight of that is to sort of be really deliberate about how we spend our money. And then the other side of that is making money, is revenue and businesses. And so, some people are in a position that if they work harder and longer, they can make more money. Other people are not. So what
Yeah.
do you do there? I don't know.
Well, yeah, and you bring up the point and just sort of deviating into where are we in terms of unemployment and employment and wages that we are paid and earning potential that we have. And I think that gives a lot of people, I think a lot of young people, it causes them quite a bit of chaos because they don't, first off, know what they are going to be doing. And they're very lost and they feel like they have to make the correct decision about where to go, like from point A to point B, where I prefer to think about it as go in the direction of your interests, aptitudes, and your dreams, And if that doesn't work out, then you got to zag, zig this way,
Yeah.
zag this way. And I don't know that a lot of people now are giving themselves the permission to do that, because there's this kind of pressure on young people to figure it out. Point A to point B, this is what you need to do. But that's not really how, in my view, that the world works as far as work goes and vocations, is you got to figure it out through time, and you're going to go this way and that way, and you're going to find your way, or you'll continue to zigzag and it's going to be fine. But a lot of people are scared and confused about where to go, so they're not going anywhere, or they're stopping, or they're in shock, and or there's not the opportunities for some people. I'm not really sure. I'm not an economist, but I do know it has to do with supply and demand. So whatever the supply is, out there, there's got to be a big demand for it. And if there's a big demand for it, then the price will go up, like gas, right? So if during the pandemic we aren't traveling because we're under lockdown, then does the price of gas go down because the demand goes down? And if there's a deficit in supply of gas, then does the price go up because it's a treasured commodity? Are people actually being mindful about their consumption of gas? Do we have to make a trip here and there and everywhere every day and use a certain amount of gas? So I think what you said about people being a little bit more mindfully consuming things. Can you fix a microwave, or do you buy a new one and throw the other one away? What do you do? And I think that's an individual choice for all of us. And I love the ideas that you came up with as far as buying local and being able to use your purchasing power wisely and figure out where you're buying stuff from. And then, the job part of it is, how much money do I have to spend, and how am I going to spend my money? But I guess I went all over the place. I guess I just zigzagged, didn't I? A bunch of different directions. And I don't know
Well,
how you would come back to that, except for that there's the earning potential part of it, and the actual, I'm able to afford this thing. And then there's the what's out there. And can I actually afford a gallon of gas today? Can I actually afford eggs? And with the money that I make.
just to put a bow on it, when economic times are tight, that is pressure that cascades into every other issue.
Mm. Well, because it's a survival
So,
issue. It has to do with money, and we get really nervous when something affects our survival. And I don't know if you've been looking at the candidates, and I did notice that. So with the Democrat side, we've got this plan that I'm not really sure that you're familiar with, but I did write it down. So on the left side with Kamala Harris, she's offering $6,000 in child care credit every year, a small business credit of $50,000 for startups, and an increase of tax for the richest, and lowering the cost of groceries and goods. Now, we don't know how we're going to get here, which all of this might sound good to some people. And you can, of course, comment on what I just said or add whatever. But the first place my mind went is, how much more in taxes am I going to have to pay? Because I am a small business owner, but I'm not a new one. I don't have any kids. And there's no incentive for me to buy a house because I've already got one. So what good is that plan going to do me? But then on the flip side, I think of, well, maybe you don't need a whole lot of help, and other people do need help in this area. Surely they've researched this and they know what the Americans need. So
well, they
with that, I want to leave it over to you, because you seemed a little bit more learned on these subjects than I am.
well, so the examples that you gave are probably very good, economic incentives for very specific people, and in certain situations, right? And so I think that they probably are well researched, but it doesn't mean that it's necessarily going to help the most people with the most good. It's focused and targeted, and it's probably focused and targeted on a demographic that they thought they could inspire to vote for them. Call me cynical, right? I think that kind of but sort of everyone needs the benefit at this point. And we need to have benefits across the board, not just really specific ones. And uh, you mentioned bringing the prices of groceries down. Uh, it's not really clear how Harris intends to bring down the prices of groceries, apart from just saying, thou shalt not charge more than $3 per gallon of milk. I just made up that number. But if they start doing that, then that's called price controls.
Mhm.
And that, in every, communist country that they've ever attempted to do that in, it leads to shortages. And, one thing that the market is really good at actually is setting prices. If you allow the economic market to function kind of the way it's supposed to, it's really good at setting prices. And the reason that everything is so expensive is for, a valid reason, which is that there's too much money and there's too much, uh, dollars in the money supply, because uh, during kind of the COVID era, they started creating massive dollars out of thin air, and gave people all kinds of little subsidies on little debit
Right.
cards so that they could spend that money. Um, and it was nice, it was nice to be able to spend that money, but that money was basically invented out of thin air, which is the way that the fiat money system works. And so the way that you pay for that is by inflation. So you have to pay more dollars. If you didn't create actual value, you only created more dollars, then it costs more dollars to buy the same thing. That's essentially what inflation is. And so if you say, you can't charge more than $3 for a gallon of milk, then people are going to be less inclined to sell a gallon of milk. And the
Mm.
reason that it costs that much in the first place is not going to change. So, you're not going to have as much milk. And that's what price controls do. And I don't think anyone actually wants to go there.
Wow, I appreciate that economic breakdown, and I really hadn't connected the two as far as that goes. As far as the price cap, I think the spirit of this is maybe like prohibiting price gouging is what I understood. So an example of that in my own life is that we've got one pet who has a thyroid condition, and our veterinarian is charging us $54 a month for these medications. Well, we found that we could get the same medication online through Chewy, and that's a corporation, right? But it was about maybe a quarter of that, so $14 for more of a supply. And so, why are veterinarians charging us so much? I don't know. And if we hadn't done the research and done some looking into the problem of like, why are we paying this much money for this medication, and can we get it less expensive? We were looking at insurance and stuff too. I guess the vet was price gouging, right? They knew that there was a need on our behalf, and because they had diagnosed him with this condition, but I think they took advantage of us and had been for years until we discovered this issue. So I think that's what I
Well,
don't
that's a
know that
great
they want to
example.
put a cap on milk, but I think they want to just prohibit this overinflated price gouging.
So price gouging is a real thing. It happens for a couple of different reasons. What you described is that your veterinarian has what's mostly a captive audience and captive customer base, that people generally are not price sensitive when they're at the vet. The vet asks the vet says, oh, this is what you need. And you nod your head up and down and you pay for the money. But if
Yeah.
you did a little bit of research, you discovered that the market actually does price that supplement or whatever it was, and that the market rate for that is a lot lower. So you get rewarded for going and finding that other thing. But if you're talking about commodities, you know, a commodity like milk, you're not going to have price gouging on milk, because you can go to every supermarket, in your town and buy milk, and it's going to be basically the same.
Mm.
You do see price gouging for something like gasoline, when they know that it's scarce and certain stores have a supply of gasoline, they know that other stores do not. And so they're like, you know what? We'll just go ahead and charge whatever we want because we know that people are going to come and buy out our supply until it's gone. And we know that our truck is not going to fill us up for another 2 weeks. That's price gouging. That's when a gas station is deliberately making more of a profit instead of serving their customers. The gas station could have said, well, we're only selling 3 gallons to each customer because we know that it's going to sell out and we don't want, people to hoard gasoline. But a private business doesn't necessarily have an incentive to do that. So price gouging comes from very specific things, but something like the price of groceries, I don't see how that is even subject to price gouging because you have so many grocery stores and they all have a very sort of specific place within the market. They're priced, a little bit higher, a little bit lower based on, their brand name and their positioning in the marketplace. But for the most part, those are commodities, and so you're not going. I don't see how you're going to get price gouging. What I hear the Harris campaign doing is trying to control the price of commodities, and if you do that in the absence of looking at what the cost of goods sold is, that's when you get shortages.
Oh, well, so you're very knowledgeable about economics. I had no idea there was that
I'm not
brain
an
in there.
economist, but I do play one on podcasts.
Oh, you do? You play one. Wow. Well, what is worthwhile is our economy and what people plan to do about it. I think that Trump's was the okay, tax cut for corporations, 20% tariff on all imports. Do you want to comment on that part? I don't know. Here, I have my economist here that I've always dreamed of. So, what do you think about that other piece?
So Trump gets a bad rap from the left for not taxing the rich, right? But what he's talking about is the corporate tax. And so corporations pay a tax. It's not the owners, it's the actual corporation, right? It's their business taxes. And so when you have high corporate taxes, then that's a direct incentive for corporations to take their business offshore. So that's when they're looking at building manufacturing plants in Mexico or in Asia, or even in places in Europe where the cost of doing business is lower. So if you cap corporate taxes, if you make corporate taxes lower, then corporations will have more of an incentive to bring their manufacturing back onshore in the United States. When you combine that with import tariffs, then that's a double incentive to do manufacturing in the United States. So what Trump is talking about is putting large tariffs on products that are imported. And often cases, and at least last time in his last administration, it was specifically for American companies that were manufacturing stuff off seas. There were very large tariffs coming into that. So placing tariffs on imported goods are a means to stimulate manufacturing of products within the United States. And that's what his proposal is all about. And last time, it was actually very effective in the first Trump administration when he implemented policies like that.
Hmm. And the dour consequences on the economy that they're talking about on the left would be what?
Basically, my interpretation of that is if your cheap plastic goods that you're buying from China are going to be more expensive.
But they're going to be American.
But the alternative is, what are you going to buy instead? If the stuff that you were getting really cheap from overseas is no longer really cheap, then you're going to make some decisions. Am I going to buy as much of that stuff, or am I going to buy something that was made in America, or am I going to save my money and not spend it on that thing?
And I think that that's probably where we can, hang our hat, is that we're going to have to make a lot of individual decisions wherever this election goes and whatever policies or procedures happen and laws happen, is that we're going to have to make our own individual minds up as far as what we're going to consume, what we're not going to consume, and how we can possibly be able to live an affordable life in this economy, in the economy that we have. Again, it's about, in my mind anyway, is about being able to know what you can change. And then when you've changed everything, then we're left with, and I still need gas, so I have to pay the $4.50 a gallon or whatever, right? That's the acceptance piece.
Yes.
Well, you ready to move on to the next topic?
Absolutely. Let's
All
move on to the next
right.
topic.
Next topic is the border. And I have to confess that I don't know anything about, well, I don't know a whole lot about the border. So I'm going to have to again depend on you to carry me through this whole thing. But you divided it into the border crossings, including cartels, drugs, human trafficking, and all that, and immigration. And so I don't even know where we want to start this discussion, because it is another hot topic that is causing a lot of people chaos. They think that bad people are coming across the border. There's illegal people taking our jobs. There's more crime in the United States because of the lax border regulations and rules put forth by the current administration. And I guess I do know a little bit more about the border than I thought I did. So there we go.
You're
There's
doing
what I
good
know.
so far.
That's what I know.
Do you have anything on the other side of that?
The other side of the border is uncertainty and possible chaos. So I'm hoping that you can make a little bit here to make sense of this. Is Ramsey Zimmerman. Make sense of all that. Like, is this happening? And if it is happening, then oh my gosh.
Well, so here's what I would say about all of that. I think there's fundamental tension because we in this nation are a nation of immigrants, and it's part of and firm to our foundation as a people that we've come from all parts of the world, especially from Europe and South America and Africa. And so we want to have immigration. We want to welcome people in, and throughout the first 200 years of our history, we welcomed people into our country. But lately, it's been more complicated than that. And lately there are some sentiments that immigration should not be happening at the rate that it does happen. But I think that there is some distinctions that ought to be made between types of immigrants. So there's people who are immigrating to the US based on going through a process, which is difficult and time consuming and expensive, but legal, and that they're working through that process in order to come to our country. And then there are people who are coming across the border illegal, and they're going through a difficult, time-consuming, expensive, and incredibly dangerous procedure in order to come to our country. And so, there's really not an upside or a positive side to either one of those. The issue with the border, so the criticism of Trump's border wall is, oh, it's racist to put up a wall at the southern border. Okay. But if you're talking about border security and having a secure border and having a physical barrier at the border to prevent people from coming across the border, then what that means is that, Trump is fond of saying that his big, beautiful wall is also going to have big, beautiful gates where people can come across the border legally and not feel like they want to try to cross a river or try to crawl through razor wire in order to get into our country. Mm-hmm. And part of that theory too is that if people know that there's a 30-foot wall that is an actual barrier, then they're not going to attempt the trek through Mexico and through South America, which is incredibly dangerous because the cartels are actually running and managing that process leading up to our southern border. And in some cases, it seems like even managing how people are crossing our border. And that is an incredibly difficult journey. There's lots of firsthand testimonies of how difficult and dangerous it is. The coyotes that manage people and help them with air quotes, to move up through Mexico and through South America. They take not just the money that they were promised, but they often take all of their money, and they're sexually abusing and raping the women that were brought up there, and they're separating sometimes the kids from their families. And I'm not talking about after they go across the border. I'm talking about on their way to the border. And people are being forced to smuggle drugs across. They're being drug mules. And, some people are being sold into like sex slavery as a result of, trying to cross the border, or indentured servanthood, working in sweatshops or in restaurants to pay off the debt of getting across the border. So, it's not a pleasant experience for those who are attempting it. And so the current administration, the Harris administration, has gotten a lot of criticism for having reversed the executive orders that the Trump administration had in place. The executive orders were essentially enabling the Customs and Border Patrol to enforce the law, which is in place. But all of those got rolled back within days of the beginning of the Harris administration. If you ask Harris, and which she was in recent interviews about the border, she'll say that, within the first few days, we were trying to drive legislation to fix the immigration policy. And that's great. I think that immigration policy needs to be fixed. But what they did do is that they removed the protections that had stopped the flow. So here's an analogy. You have a patient and they have been, cut up with, a knife or something, and they've got all of these wounds, they're bleeding. And, you put bandages on all of the wounds in order to stop the bleeding and decide, before you can do whatever kind of surgeries you need. But let's say that the surgeons are having a disagreement about exactly which surgeries they need. Is it right to go ahead and just remove all of the bandages while the surgeons are discussing how best to do the type of treatment and care that they need? Because then the patient is just bleeding out. Another analogy would be a group of engineers talking about how to fix a dam, and the dam has all of these cracks and holes, and you have all these patches to try to keep the water back. But then should you go ahead and just remove all of the temporary patches and fixes on the dam while you're discussing and making the plans for replacing the dam?
Now I see what you're saying. So they actually repealed what Trump had in place before they actually ran through Congress what they had proposed. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay.
That is correct.
Yeah, and that's the part I think that has been left out of some of the interviews, because I think we probably watched the same ones or listened to the same one. With Harris was saying, like, within hours of the being sworn in process, that they were at work on this border issue and Congress rejected it. And there was some Democrats who actually voted against it as well, but it did not pass. And then we were kind of left with nothing is what she, and then of course, I think she blamed Trump's influence on the people not passing it. And I don't know if that's true or not. I'm one of those people that if you don't show me the paper trail or a phone conversation or a videotape, I'm going to have to be a little bit iffy on whether I believe that that's actually true, that it is Trump's influence, unless I see that, at 3:45 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, there's this voicemail from Donald Trump to Lindsey Graham and a bunch of other senators or House people saying, vote this bill down. I don't know that I'll believe it. I'm not really sure if most American consumers of the media and news are going to think like I do, but that's kind of the way I think, is like an auditor.
Well, yes. And so Donald Trump's favorite chart, he says, is a chart of the immigration the crossings across the southern border, and how low it was right at the time when he left office, and how it immediately spiked as after he left office. And so, that's sort of the documentation of what actually happened in terms of how many people came across the border. And so, the what he would credit that with is the executive orders that he put in place, which built parts of the wall, and that uh, reduced people from coming across, and that when people were captured, they were released in Mexico. They were not released in the United States. But those were, like I said, those were rescinded within days, and that's the downside of executive orders. They come and go with the executive.
Mhm.
Each administration puts in their executive orders, but they can be removed by the next one. And so I do agree that the problems should be fixed by Congress, by the laws, but a cynical interpretation, perhaps, of why the Harris administration removed uh, all of those executive orders. It could have been for political leverage, because if the problem was basically solved by the executive orders, or mostly solved, then there's less leverage to come to a different negotiated legal settlement. But I would hope and like to see that we, stop the bleeding before we have a real conversation about how to perform surgery and save the patient.
Mhm. Well, so then is the border a really big problem then, or is it just something that's inflated, to a political issue that's just being used to win an election, is what my question is. Is it really a problem or not?
Well, I think it's really a problem to all of the people who have an incredibly difficult time trying to come across the southern border illegally. First of all, those people have terrible experiences. Secondly, it's probably a real problem to the people who live in border towns, and along the border, who are impacted by things like cartel violence. I think that it's a real problem for based on the amount of fentanyl that is being
Mm,
smuggled across the southern border, and how much of an epidemic of addiction that we have in our country.
mhm,
And you said to win an election, many people believe that here's an even more pessimistic interpretation, that the reason they opened the border was to bring in as many people through the southern border so they could fast track them to become lifelong Democrat voters. You
mm.
know,
There's a
estimates
conspiracy
of
theory that Ramsey's come up with, or
I
you are
didn't come
bringing
up
up.
with it.
You're bringing up.
Well, uh, even low estimates of the number of people who have come across the border since the beginning of this administration are around 6 million. Some people estimate that as many as 10 million people have come
Mm,
across the southern border illegally. The fact is that the motor voter law in the United States says that when you apply for a driver's license, you can also apply to vote in our country. And in most cases, you just need to check a box. Hey, are you a US citizen? They're not asking for any documentation about whether or not you're a US
mm.
citizen. Undocumented people are encouraged, they're able to get driver's licenses. All they have to do is check one extra box and register to vote. So none of that is a theory, that's actual fact.
Hmm. Well, interesting. I didn't know that they didn't check documentation when you check the box, but I don't remember having to produce my own birth certificate when I applied for my driver's license or registered to vote either. So
I mean, never
you're
mind that. It's now Governor Newsom just signed a law in California that it's illegal for any jurisdiction to even ask for identification when voting.
Oh, wow. Well, isn't that part of the voting process though? People who do not mail in like we do in Washington state, but people who go out to polls, they have to show their ID or something, right?
That's a very long, different issue that's not on our list. Voter
Oh,
ID. We could go down that rabbit hole for quite a while.
well, let's stay on track and so the border is a real problem for those who try and cross it, and for the drug cartels and for the drugs that are coming in. And then also this possible conspiracy theory that the Democrats are just letting people in here because they know that if they do under this administration, that the people will likely vote for them and they can register to vote fairly easily and without documentation. Did I sum that up accurately, Ramsey, or did I miss something?
No, I think you hit those. But the one other big point I'll make around this issue gets back in many ways to the economy, which is that people in our country are feeling a whole lot of pressure for their own livelihoods and for their own jobs, and they people feel and perceive that as immigrants come into the country, they become competition for jobs and competition for um, themselves in general. And so there is pressure in that way too. And especially when people see that illegal immigrants are receiving benefits from the government, things like food stamps or potentially incentives for things like higher education or for housing and things like that, then people wonder why, as American citizens, how they're not being helped more. Instead, the people who are theoretically not even supposed to be here, how are they entitled to any form of assistance if they're not entitled to actually be on American soil?
Mhm.
That's a question that some people are asking themselves.
So, yeah. So Harris is saying that she wants to cut the flow of illegal immigrants, reduce the fentanyl, and there was a bill. Yeah, and we've covered that. So on the other side, on the right, Trump wants to have this domestic deportation that would include the National Guard and possibly the police. And he had listed something about 11 million deportees, and to destroy the drug cartels, go back to his former plans. So once he clears them out, then go back to his original border protection plan. And so, yeah, for me, that causes me some chaos. It's like, first off, how are we going to find the people? And if we find the people, then how are we going to deport them? And it just sounds too Holocausty for me. And I just don't like the feel of that. But I wanted to ask you what you thought of that.
I think something like deportation sounds really terrifying and really scary, and it's not something that anyone takes lightly. But if you look at Trump's plans, he talks about doing them according to a certain order. So first of all, it's capture and release in Mexico, as opposed to capture and release in the United States
Okay.
for people who are apprehended coming across the border. And then it's people who are captured by the police committing actual crimes. So once if they are in fact undocumented and they've been caught committing a crime, then having a fast track to deportation at that point. So um, as a result of criminal activity, uh, it does not sound like, I mean, I think the fear that people have, and I don't know if it's justified or not, but the fear that people have is that, a Gestapo like force is going to start just rounding up families that have been in the country minding their own business for years and just disrupting all of that. And
Mhm.
that sounds terrible. And I really hope and I think that that's not really what they're talking about and not what they're prioritizing.
Mhm. Yeah, well, and that brings up, and when you were talking, I was thinking, maybe that's what they did, is take a tiny little idea and run with it and made it into something that really is, just totally beyond what would actually happen if Trump did win the election and started putting these policies into place. And yeah, all it really takes these days is, I think you mentioned echo chambers, is that somebody says something or an idea and it echoes and it gets louder and louder and it keeps repeating over and over until fear is pervasive around this world, or around this in this country, among our people. And then we're glued to these ideas and we don't have the flexibility enough to figure it out or have these conversations like we're having to really get to the truth. And people are glued to the stories instead of the truth. And really, when you think about it, we can't predict the future either, because we don't know what's going to happen. We don't know what is going to happen if either one of these people get elected into office. And then we get a fresh, wave of fear and panic. So I'm glad you're here to help me to understand a little bit more about the border and some of the policies around it. But that's the part I would add, is that I wish that we wouldn't perpetuate these ideas that may or may not be based in truth. We don't know what's going to happen right now. And that would be awful if it did. But the way people are making it sound is like, if Trump is elected into office, then this stuff will be like reminiscent of the Holocaust. They are saying that, and it's really getting a lot of people scared.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and echo chambers, political campaigns, they intentionally, both sides, completely guilty. Every side is guilty of this. Try to make the other side out to sound as bad and as scary and as terrible as possible, because they are using emotion and they're driving emotion to an outcome. Mm-hmm. And in the case of politics, the outcome is for you to be really angry and to vote against the other side and to vote for their side and to, do all these other things. And in the case of social media, the reason that they want you to be angry and engaged is so that you'll keep reading and so that you'll look at it longer, so that you'll click more links, so you'll have more time on their platform. They're not out to inform you. And if it's the mainstream media, they're making you angry so that you stay tuned and you see the commercial and you stay on during the commercial break.
Yeah, I never really thought of that in terms of how much time I spend on YouTube. Really? Who am I making money for now? Maybe I'll be a more conscientious consumer of YouTube in the future.
If you have a free service, you are the customer. Any free service, you're not the customer, you are the product. If you think that you're the customer and it's a free service, you're not. You are the product. Someone is paying to have you on there.
Ooh, that sounds dastardly. Like there's somebody up there just going like this, like Dr. Evil or something like that. Well, all right. So for what it's worth, the border is a real problem. And so I will not shirk from looking at that a little bit more closely, taking what you said into consideration. Well, that was really fun. I thought that went well. And although Ramsey and I don't have exactly the same viewpoints, we were able to bring a lot of different points to the table in part 1. So make sure and check out part 2, where we discuss 2 additional issues that are important to American people to consider when going to voting day or the election, whatever you want to call it. And we will see you there. In the meantime, take care. Thanks for listening to Calming the Chaos podcast. If you found this podcast interesting or helpful, please like, subscribe, and share it with your friends. You can also go to www.calmingthechaospodcast.com to listen to all Calming the Chaos podcast episodes. I look forward to sharing my next podcast episode with you. In the meantime, take care.